Gary Nickerson,
And I'm Quinn Taggart.
and this is Outside My Window.
If you live or work in the town of Yarmouth, it's no secret that the deer population has grown in recent years, and not just by a small margin. In some cases, people have reported seeing 15, 20 deer in their yard at any one given time. While beautiful, they are becoming more and more of an issue each year. We are not alone, though, as many other towns across the province are experiencing the same problem. A key step in implementing a deer management strategy involved forming a deer management working group, which includes Town of Yarmouth staff, councillors, Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources and Renewables, as well as members of the community and other experts, with the hope of developing a comprehensive strategy to solve the deer population issue. In this week's chat, we first have a conversation with Tricia Fleming. She's a human-wildlife coexistence biologist with the Wildlife Division of the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables, and she's joining us from her office in Kentville. So, Tricia, one of the biggest concerns that seem to have been raised from the user survey or user-based survey that the town conducted, the top three concerns were vehicle deer collisions, damage to landscaping, property gardens, ornamental plants. I'm not sure what an ornamental plant is. And then, of course, ticks and Lyme disease. And those were the top three in order. But you've got some actual hard data when it comes to vehicle deer collisions. So maybe you can expand on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the constraints around the deer vehicle collision question is it's first of all based on reports. So who actually reports when they have a collision? Not everybody does that. And who do they report to? So some of those reports go directly to our department, so the Department of Natural Resources Renewables, but then other reports go to the RCMP, for example. So we did at the town hall meeting have some graphs. So we have some information based on what we've been reported to us. We've also been fortunate to work with the RCMP, and we have some information from them. And so you're looking at, when I look at the two lines for the areas within the town of Yarmouth, from the RCMP perspective, it stays fairly constant. There was a little blip around 2020. We saw that little blip as well, where we had some more reports as well. And you're looking at, you're looking at below 5 per year for RCMP. And we had near 2020, we had up to 8 at one point, but we're under 5 as well for the majority of the other years. And sorry, that's from our information is from 2010 to present at the deer committee meeting, and the RCMP data was from 2005 until up until that meeting.
Now, the deer encroachment into populated areas is not a quote unquote new problem, but it just seems to have gotten to a point where people feel like we really got to do something about it. There's been a few other municipalities that have taken this challenge on. Truro was one of them. What is it that we've been able to learn from how Truro has dealt with it that we could possibly apply to the town of Yarmouth's management committee?
Yeah, and I think, anytime you have a community that you can relate to, whether it's in, Nova Scotia has its values, it being within the same province, or compared to other places that might have similar population levels from deer perspective and people, it always provides some value, is kind of give you some ideas of what may or may not be to help direct the deer management strategy. So the Truro situation, actually, a lot of those conversations began before I started in this position, but so I can speak fairly generally about it, but the specifics about why they made certain decisions and how it all led up to that was before my time. But they have gone through the process of developing a deer management strategy. They have outlined their goals, their objectives, how they're planning on measuring those factors, and then they've put multiple management options in place or are working towards putting more in place. So I think they provide a good example of how the process can work. And also, I'm sure that there were one of the first in Nova Scotia to go through that whole process. They also can learn from, the things they found that have worked really well for them and the things that didn't work really well for them. And then any town, including the town of Yarmouth, can take some of that information and decide, does that work for our population, for our geography? How can we learn from, the things that didn't go so well, and how can we learn from things that did go well? So I think any of those, being able to do those extrapolations from other places is valuable.
How many of the options that are in the handout that were given out in the November meeting, how many of them are really feasible? I mean, I'm looking through the options. We've got capture and release, capture and euthanasia, managed urban bow hunt, fertility control by immunocontraception. Sorry, I'm going to butcher that. And fertility control by surgical sterilization. I mean, how many of those options are really feasible given the situation here in Yarmouth?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to take that question, I'm going to just step it back like one level. And so, generally speaking, for management options, there are two general categories. So we have the damage control category, which focuses on managing the negative impacts of deer. And then the other category is deer mitigation, which focuses on methods to reduce the local deer population. So all of the ones that you just listed, those would be under the damage mitigation. And so examples of deer control would be, or damage control, sorry, would be, fencing, repellents, plant selection, scare tactics, wildlife crossings for roadways, and things like that. And you've already mentioned several deer mitigation or damage mitigation methods. So, and often what, the literature indicates is that the best approaches involve an integration of multiple management options but they also have to suit the community's needs and goals. And to me, that's a really big factor in answering the question that you asked. So which ones are appropriate for Yarmouth? It really depends on several things. And a big one is, what are the overall goals that the town has for their deer management strategy? So once you establish what the goals are, then you can more easily say, okay, then, what will fit into these goals? How will we reach our goals using these methods? And then when you have a list of methods like this, then there's other factors that you look at. So, finances come into it, deer welfare comes into it, feasibility of, can we actually do this in our community, based on geography and location and other, restrictions, or, for example, firearms restrictions or things like that. And then the next step is then, if the town decides that they're going to attempt one of these options, then they apply to the Department of Natural Resources for permitting. So, and then we will review those permitting options and decide if it fits under the legislation that we work under.
Because the deer have, been roaming around the town for so long, are they almost at a point where they're domesticated? Is that the right phraseology for the situation?
I wouldn't necessarily say domesticated. A term we use more is human habituated, so that they're very used to humans. And and this happens with deer. It happens with other wildlife as well. And often one of the facts that how this happen is that at first there is a lot of fear of humans naturally, but then when they have interactions over time with humans or with human developed areas, and there's not, a negative enough of a negative repercussion to prevent them from pursuing what they're looking for, then they just get used to it, and it just becomes, oh well, I did that once, and it didn't go negatively on me, so it should be okay, and then it just kind of builds. So, for example, a deer might eat your tulips one time, and if nobody's around to yell at it or something like that, it says, "Oh, well, that wasn't too bad." Or it might be one of those situations where there's just not a lot of food around that year, and even if you're yelling at it, it can handle taking the yelling to get the food because it really needs the food. So it's really based on what they need, what they're getting, and if there's the negative impact of what they're doing is enough to prevent them from doing it.
So is it reasonable to expect at some point that maybe if they do quote unquote run out of food that they'll just kind of mosey along and go back into the country?
That that would be a possibility because it's also a bigger picture. Food is a main driver of, what an animal needs in its habitat, but there's other things as well. They need appropriate bedding locations, but really, food is a big one. So in theory, yes. I'm not sure. I'm not sure where, when, or how that would happen because there's usually food around. So there's usually, there's always going to be lawns to eat grass, and that's usually tasty grass. Well, I've not tasted it myself, but I can imagine from a peer perspective that
Yeah, I'll take your word
probably
for it.
tasty grass. Yeah. And other things. So like the plant selection at people's houses that encourage feeding, and then there's the factor of are people purposely feeding deer in specific locations, and I don't know if that's occurring in Yarmouth or not.
Well, certainly there's a bylaw in place to, not do that. It's a pretty hefty fine of $1,000, I believe, if you're caught, feeding the wildlife. But as the population increases over time, you would think at some point there becomes a tipping point between available food resources and the population of the deer in general.
Yeah, and you're right. And so we actually call that the biological carrying capacity. So that's the level at which um, the local ecosystem can support a specific amount of or population level of deer. And so once you reach that level, then it's kind of like nature's way of managing population levels. So once you reach that level, then usually you see a drop off of population because it just can't grow beyond that. What we also see, so that's one of the carrying capacities. Another carrying capacity that usually influences deer management um, higher than the biological one is the social carrying capacity. And that's the level of deer population at which the local human population can tolerate.
Yeah, and then we'll get some people, kind of going off on their own and dealing with things on their own. And I guess, we want to try to avoid that from happening. One of the things, of course, that comes to mind is natural predators. So in the wild, of course, the deer will have some natural predators, but in the town, in the confines of the town, we haven't seen much of that happen. But is that a danger that their natural predators will also come into town? That's just going to compound things.
I guess it's a possibility. I haven't seen research to suggest that that's either occurring in Nova Scotia or other places. So theoretically, yes. I just haven't seen the research to back that up.
Yeah, and certainly that just would compound things. I mean, we've always had trouble within the town with things like raccoons and other assorted wildlife from coming in and causing issues, but it hasn't seemed to approach the levels that we're seeing with the deer. So, what's next? Where are we at with things on the deer management plan, and what can we expect to have happen in the next 6 to 8 months?
Yeah, and so right now, so I am a member of the Deer Management Committee, and the town is looking to do some baseline data collection. So it's really important when you're thinking about conducting, any kind of management strategy where you're going to implement options. Um, it's hard to understand if your management options are working if you don't know where you are to start with. So right now there's some work being done to get some general information about the deer populations in the town and where they're located. And then the next steps, so that's the main step that's being worked on right now. And then moving forward, they're still in discussion, but a big one from my perspective would be that is really establishing what are the goals. That's a really big piece because the goals can then really direct everything else. Really, what management options you choose, how you're going to establish whether they're effective or not. Yeah, so I see that being then another next big step.
And then, once a decision may be arrived at, with town council, you mentioned that the next step would be to seek permission from the Department of Natural Resources?
Yeah, and it really just depends what what the management choice is. So under the Wildlife Act, if a deer is or may cause property damage, the owner or occupier of that property may use all reasonable methods to scare away the offending deer. So really, when we talked about the different deer management options, the options on the damage control, that would fall under scaring. So those do not require a permit from the department. But however, removal of individual deer is done only by valid license or permit. So if you're looking more at some of those other options that would look at the damage mitigation, then those would require permitting.
We also spoke to Councilor Gildayers. He's the chair of the Deer Management Committee for the town of Yarmouth about what we could take away from the other communities that have gone through the same experience. So, Gil, after talking with TIR for a bit, what it seems like it's coming down to is that, you're able to kind of draw on other communities and what they've been doing, like Truro, and you're able to draw on, other communities globally that might have had this similar situation. But how much of that have you been able to actually use?
Well, for the most part, what we've done is we've spent a lot of time researching what other communities have done, what's worked, what hasn't. And that's given us the ability to, I think, probably exclude some of the possibilities. And I'll say, for instance, some people feel that relocation is, let's tranquilize and relocate. Well, there's a few problems with that. And when you start to look into the results of that effort, you'll find that to begin with, a lot of the animals, not a lot of them, but some animals will die because of the shock and they won't survive. There's at least one community that I'm aware of where they had, and I'll just throw out a number, like 100 deer that they relocated. What they found was that 60% or 65% of them, it was basically cruelty because they died within 30 days and they had them tracked. And then 25% found their way back to an urban environment. So the cost of trying to relocate a large animal, the expense of that, and only to find out that it's just not working. We know that there's other communities that have introduced culls, and the cull has worked to possibly stabilize the population, but they haven't seen a decline in the population. So we don't know if that's the only answer, is that's the sole way to deal with this, or do we have to incorporate other measures as well? I had people come up to me and say that, why not trap, neuter, and release? And my answer to them is that these are not kittens at the wharf. These are large wild animals. And so, having a surgical team standing by, and I mean, just the expense of that alone, it's just not worth the effort. So basically what we're doing is we're looking at all the possibilities. Is there any kind of a contraceptive that can be introduced? Anything that we can look at. So we've spent a lot of time, the first year was doing a lot of that. We also, though, did a roadside count. We wanted to see what we could determine to be the problem in the town of Yarmouth. And so for 2 weeks in October, for an hour after sunrise and an hour before sunset, we had somebody on the road. And of course, we couldn't cover the whole town, so we're doing about, I'd say, 30% of the town. And they would do a count of deer sightings, and the numbers ranged from about 30 up to a high of 74. So in one Friday evening, in an hour or an hour and a half before sunset, we counted 74 deer. And we're confident that we counted 74 different deer, because if we saw 3 deer on the golf course and then 5 minutes later saw 3 deer on Kemp Street, we didn't double count. So we're confident that the 74 was an accurate figure.
Well, it was the weekend. They were coming to town for party.
Yeah, it could be. But, it's amazing that, and just how urbanized a deer can become. I remember reading in one of the research studies that deer will actually learn to use crosswalks. And I honestly laughed out loud. I thought, no, this can't be true.
Well, I heard people saying they were looking both ways before they went across the road.
I've actually experienced it in my vehicle driving down Chestnut Street. There are 3 deer walking down the sidewalk. They stopped at the corner, And when I came to the stop sign and stopped, they crossed in front of me.
Wow.
And I thought, this can't be true. Like, but apparently they become normalized to where the traffic stops and when it's safe to cross. And so, actually, I told this story to a gentleman one night, and we were talking about the deer population, and he said, "I'm so glad you told me that story." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I was coming from the hospital one night, and there were 3 deer at the corner, and when the light turned green, they crossed." And he said, "I was looking around to see, did anybody else see this?" Like, you know. But the truth of the matter is that because they've become so urbanized, I guess is the only thing I can think of to call it, you don't find them running out in front of cars. You don't find them, easily frightened. So, I mean, I had 6 in my backyard last night that were 20 feet from my deck, and I'm standing on the deck with my wife talking to the deer, and they're looking at us, and then they bow their head and continue to eat. Like, it's like there's no issue. So they're not, running out in front of cars or, that kind of thing. So possibly there's some benefits to them being domesticated a little bit.
Now, collisions was one of the top 3 concerns that the citizens had with the survey that you guys did online. And the numbers from natural resources didn't seem to support, the reality of that per se, unless there's collisions that aren't getting reported. But I mean, it doesn't take much to do $1,500 damage to a car. But do you feel that the deer population in town is not cycling out? Like, are some moving back out into the county and new ones coming in? Like, is it going around in a circle?
It's hard to say. I mean, in our neighborhood, for example, it was very common for the first summer before last to see 2 bucks almost daily, and I haven't seen a buck in that area in the last probably 18 months. So, so have they moved on? I don't know. You mentioned collisions, and I know that we were getting a lot of anecdotal evidence about the number of deer that are hit and killed, and I think sometimes the numbers were exaggerated. People thought that it was happening a lot more than it had, and I mean, I know somebody that's hit 2 in town, but I've never even come close.
Now, near misses, on the other hand, there seemed to be a fair, ticket. But of course, natural resources doesn't track that particular part.
And somebody said to me one time, they said, "I think there were more pedestrians hitting Yarmouth last year than there were deer," and I don't know that to be true either. But I think that we can't just rely on anecdotal evidence. At one point it was reported to us that there were 30 deer struck and killed in town in a 12-month period. When I checked with the people that are responsible for removing the carcasses, they said since 2008 there haven't been 30 deer. So, the numbers don't align. And you're right. The statistics that we know of from the RCMP and from insurance companies and that lots of deer are hitting Yarmouth County, but a lot of those are in Tuscot, Arcadia, out in the rural areas, and we can't use those figures.
No, certainly on the highway we see a fair chunk of those, as time goes by. Is it going to be one of the major challenges of any action plan that you put into place, the fact that the deer are human acclimated or whatever? They seem to be a little bit more in tune with their environment and comfortable in the environment.
They're becoming completely normalized to the urban lifestyle. And, I drove down Main Street one night not long ago, and right across from where the Blueberry Cafe is, there was a deer standing on the sidewalk eating the grass, like on Main Street, and traffic everywhere. So yeah, you see them everywhere. And, I've been doing a lot of walking lately, and I can tell you that, you walk by and they're like 15 feet away from you, and they just totally ignore you. So, one of the things that we did do, because we were getting, I was, I had accepted the challenge of being the chair of the deer management strategy, and so I guess I became a bit of a lightning rod for complaints and information, and I expected that, but it was like a daily occurrence for me. It was either a Facebook message, or it was somebody I was talking to in the grocery store or on the street, or I'd get a phone call, and I was getting messages, calls, or conversations on a pretty much daily basis. So with that, back in November, we decided that we'd have a public information session so we could get the information out to people about why these strategies have been considered, what works, what doesn't, why they work, why they don't. So I think we had like close to 100 people come in that night to get the information, and ironically, and I didn't expect this, but ironically, the complaints to me personally became almost non-existent. It was like, okay, now I know. And we also tried to tell people these are the strategies that have been deployed already, like people that have used, scented products, or people that have used netting, or those type of things, and the success that they've had. So we were able to show them, like somebody said that use this type of, I mean, I remember we went to the nursery out in Dayton, and we were assured the tree that my wife really, really wanted was deer-proof. And so we bought it, and it was roughly close to $100 for this little tree. And I said, yeah, well, good luck with this. So we brought it home and planted it, and I was really surprised because the next morning I got up and it was in perfect shape. And then the following morning I got up and there wasn't a leaf on it. So and I thought it was kind of funny that this was a deer-proof. So we had at one point actually considered issuing a list of deer deterrent plants for your garden, things that the deer wouldn't eat. Well, what we've determined since then is deer don't eat these plants until they do.
Yes.
And that was the issue. Like, when we lived on the harbor, my wife had, I think on our property, she had 110 hostas altogether. You can imagine how many of those are left, but, yeah, and I really do. I really feel bad for those people that have heritage gardens and this is their hobby. It's good for their mental health. It's good for their physical health. It's something they love to do, and I really feel bad for the fact that the deer, quite honestly, will decimate their gardens. And so we really are trying to seek a solution that is appropriate. As you can imagine, it's a bit of an emotional issue for some people. I have my daughter, for example, she had two lovely, lovely plants right in front of her picture window. And one night, I think a herd of deer must have descended upon her yard, and the next morning there was nothing left but the roots, I think, really. And her comment to me was, well, Dad, they must have been hungry. So you've got that kind of an attitude that people that don't want to see the deer hurt, don't want to see anything happen to them. And then you've got, the other side of the coin, people that, are fed up. We've had enough.
Well, I mean, certainly wildlife is going to follow the food source. In town, it doesn't seem like the food source is going to go away. So therefore, the deer is likely not going to go away. But we're in a generational thing with those deer now. They've been in town and propagating and birthing and cycling around. That there's generations of deer in the area that don't know anything else other than town. So even if you did try to relocate them, they don't know how to deal in the wild.
And that's just it. They don't know what to eat in the wild. I can tell you this. When I moved here, it's been 40 years ago, and we'd be patrolling the streets at night. On a rare occurrence, you might see a deer on, say, Prospect Street, or maybe one down by the golf course, right, on a very rare occasion. But to go out on a Friday evening and count 74, you know what I mean? So that's the difference. You're right. It's been a population explosion, and the deer that are living here now, for the most part, are quite likely were born in town. So, on the other hand, I've been out, in the country, and I can tell you, I was really surprised one time because it was out in a rural area, and there was a house that was quite a ways off the road, and the driveway was lined with hostas, and not a bite out of them. So the deer in the country don't know what a hosta tastes like, or something. I mean, so the food source is different, and it's what they become accustomed to. Deer in the woods will eat a lot of moss and lichen and things like that, but deer in town, no, they prefer your hostas and your tulips.
Sarcasm and all that aside, what's the plan here? Where are we at?
Okay, so the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables has, ultimately they're the ones that have, the final say over what happens with wildlife. And so we have to establish, I guess, a baseline. And So their practice is when they want to find out how many deer are living in a particular area, they do what's called a pellet group inventory. So basically, they count the scat, and now the way they do this in the rural areas, for example, is they'll set up a transect that's like 1 kilometer in a straight line, and they'll walk that transect in the spring of the year after the snow melts. They'll walk that transect and they'll count the pellets on, not the individual pellets, but the piles on a 1 meter on either side, so a 2 meter strip, and they'll count that, and then they can extrapolate from that how many deer they believe live in that particular area. I'm not so sure that we can replicate that in the town of Yarmouth, because you try to find a place where you can walk even a half a kilometer in a straight line, it's difficult. So we staff did the best job they could in coming up with a variety of transects, and so we did engage a retired wildlife biologist who set up the plan and engage the people to go out and actually do the count. I'm not sure what the results of that yet. We're still waiting on that report, but that was hopefully establish a baseline. I do have reservations about whether or not we can get any kind of an accurate count that way, only because of the difficulty in finding a place where you can walk in a straight line and count on either side without, climbing over somebody's fence or up over their house. It's just difficult in town. And I know that they've done that in Truro, for example, but Truro's, if you've been to Truro and Truro's, the layout of Truro is significantly different than the layout of the town of Yarmouth. Sure. We're a lot denser. I mean, we've only got 11 square kilometers of real estate here, and trying to find a one kilometer straight line is not easy. Now, I know that they were able to do some of the transects just outside the town limit, because they assume that those deer that are just outside the town limit also, visit the town. So,
sure.
Yep.
Just like the residents.
Yes, exactly.
People will come in.
Yep.
So once you've got your baseline, is there an idea of like what's next?
It depends on how serious the problem is considered, but certainly Truro went the route of having an organized call. That may be the next, one of the next position that we take is to try to do that. However, we still haven't given up on the ideas of contraceptive methods, this sort of thing. So we have one of the members of our committee that's actually engaging with Dalhousie University to see if there's anything they can do to assist us in some kind of a study. But we're still continuing to do research. This problem is not confined to the town of Yarmouth. I mean, this is right across the country, and if you want to look at urban deer populations, it's throughout North America, throughout the UK. I've seen videos of like 100 deer crossing the road in England. It's just incredible. And when I was out I was out visiting in Victoria in a year and a half ago now, but one of the issues that they had was an urban deer population, and they had they had an inoculation contraceptive. So what they were doing is they were tranquilizing and injecting a contraceptive that they think is going to last for a number of years, not just an annual thing. But in order to make sure that you're doing it properly, I think they had to tag the deer on the ear. So like say the year 2023 was a yellow tag and the year 2024 was an orange tag, and so you'd always know which deer. And I'll tell you, we were driving around Victoria a little bit, and then the outskirts, and there were deer everywhere. I mean, you drive by a cemetery and there'd be like 20 deer in the cemetery. So, I know that the problem is in Antigonish. They're having the problem with the deer, and I said Truro, but I mean, really, I saw a picture of 15 deer running down the 4-lane through the center of Bathurst. So it's right across the country and throughout the states.
Are we worried about other wildlife encroachments? Because, I mean, obviously food being the main reason wildlife's going to migrate, the deer are food for other animals within the wildlife spectrum. So are we worried about them coming to town?
Yeah, I think there should be a concern. I mean, I've actually stood in my backyard, and I live in town. I've stood in my backyard, and I can hear coyotes over off Prospect Street or over off Lakeside Drive. Now, that's not uncommon. 20 years ago, I could stand in my driveway and listen to coyotes out in Overton howling at night. So it's not like it's a unique situation, but yeah, that is a concern that, the coyotes, if they get hungry enough, will come into town looking for deer. And we don't have, I know that it was suggested to me one time by the biologist that, if we had 3 harsh winters in a row, that would reduce the population. Well, I'm living in Yarmouth, and I can tell you, I don't remember one harsh winter in a row. I remember one 3-week period where it was harsh for 3 weeks, but pretty much that's it.
Yeah.
And we've had winters where I took a broom and dusted off my doorstep twice. So I don't think we can rely on Mother Nature to look after the deer population, unless it is by predator.
So if anybody wants more information about the deer management plan, the Town of Yarmouth's website has its own section for the deer plan?
Yeah, and go to the Get Involved site, and we'll have some information on there. But we're happy to have the discussion with anybody that wants to talk to us. And I know the committee members are committed to finding solutions and not being irrational about it. We've looked at, contemplated all the things that have been presented to us, and one by one we're either just not paying attention to them because they're not going to work. If you can't, for example, trap, neuter, release, it's just not a viable option. So we don't want to look into that any further. And also, even if we were to find out that tranquilizing and relocating was an option, the department would never allow that anyway, because those deer could be carrying disease that you're now relocating to another area. The white-tailed deer is not a native species to Nova Scotia. They were introduced, and I think that the truth of the matter is it's a great climate for them. It's a great environment for them to expand, and I guess I'm kind of thinking sometimes I look at I've been to Banff, and see an elk walking down the main street, and they're totally accepted. They're not molested by the public in any way, shape, or form. So, and although I'm not sure that'll ever become the norm here in Yarmouth, I certainly think that there's got to be at some point in time we have to accept the fact that we can't totally eliminate the deer population.
We want to thank our guests from this week, Tricia Fleming, Human-Wildlife Coexistence Biologist with the Wildlife Division of the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables, and Councilor Gil Dares, Chair of the Deer Management Committee for the Town of Yarmouth.
I'm Gary Nickerson.
And I'm Quinn Taggart.
And this has been Outside My Window.